Welcome back to Neighbors in the Network. I'm James Pinedo, your host, joined by my very special co-host, Corey Burres. Corey, what's up today?
Hey, James, it's always good to be talking with you and to talk about amazing people in our network.
It really is. And speaking of amazing people, this episode continues the conversation that we had with Nic Dunn, the Vice President of Strategy and the Senior Fellow at the Sutherland Institute. Corey, what stands out to you about this, the second part of our conversation?
Well, I think what's amazing what Nick does in this portion is kind of dive into that story element of the narrative behind why all of this matters, right? And which is the people. And so he talks about his journey, which I think is fascinating, of how he got involved in this idea and this area of interest, but also talking about how valuable hearing the stories of people that are impacted by these policies, how much that knowledge and discussion has changed the way that they address welfare policy in their state.
Yeah. Well, Corey, I loved going on this journey where we got to know Nick better. So thanks again. Shall we dive in?
Let's do it.
Nick, I'm so glad you brought up. Okay, I'm having all of these very visceral flashbacks right now. When you're talking about getting out of poverty, I'm thinking about, living out of my car in the streets of LA. Like that's like it's right in my mind right now. And now I'm also thinking back to other podcasts that I've had in the past about where, in other lives I was in the filmmaking sphere, and so I had a filmmaking podcast, but I was debating a professor that was in LA that was talking about how the solution to poverty is socialism. And we were talking, and it got very, we were very friendly with each other, but at the same time very much disagreeing about everything. So tell me, let's talk about the philosophy a little bit. Why is it that your solution, and I'm sorry I'm going off book here, but I can't help it. Why is it that your solution is what it is, helping people to come out of poverty by self-reliance and those and that bent, as opposed to a more social a solution that borders on socialism?
I think for a couple of reasons. One practical and one moral, spiritual, philosophical. The practical one is that free enterprise, you just look at the data. Arthur Brooks has talked about this at length over the years. And he's big. His work has been a big inspiration to me on the issue of poverty and kind of what is the conservative philosophical approach to poverty and upward mobility. I think it's very important. But free enterprise has done more to lift people out of poverty globally than any other force in the world. And that's just, it's incredibly hard to argue against that when you look at the data of the number of people globally. We're talking billions that have not experienced poverty because of the growth and the expansion of the free enterprise system. So one, just in practical terms, robust economies, strong opportunity and upward mobility, and strong civic institutions, we can't overlook that. That's really important. But those ingredients together create an environment that is better at reducing poverty than anything else we've seen as a society, as humanity. So practically, I think the evidence is just clear that true free enterprise works better than other things that might get debated. The second point is, again, on this kind of very human, almost spiritual level, is that there is an essential dignity on a very human level to earned success. Again, that's another Arthur Brooks term. As I said, he's a great inspiration for me. But this idea of earned success, and again, we see it with the families that we talk to when we're working on this issue. When they say, I got a raise at work, and they're overjoyed by it, that you do not elicit that same kind of response when someone says, I got this provision of benefits from the government. Don't get me wrong, these families are often very grateful for the government benefits because, again, they address essential needs. And of course they're grateful for that stabilization, again, the feeling of security that I don't have to worry if my kids are going to be fed, if they're going to have a safe place to sleep, if they're going to get medical care that they need. In those moments, of course they're grateful for that. It's a little different when they say, I worked and I earned this paycheck, and I worked and earned my way up and out of poverty. To share an anecdote, again, to really drive this point home, in some of my previous work, I worked, as I mentioned, with the Department of Workforce Services here in Utah in a prior role a number of years ago. And in the course of that work, we were working on the homelessness issue here in the state. And in the course of my duties, I had to essentially find someone to help, tell the story of some of the various interventions that the state was deploying on homelessness. And so I was essentially just in a role where I got to talk to people who were experiencing homelessness. And and talk about their story, essentially. And I met a man who was formerly homeless here in Utah. But when I met him, he was living in a supportive housing facility here in Utah, so government funded. It was a specific intervention for the chronically homeless. Essentially, it was the housing first model at the time. And anyway, so he was in this supportive housing facility, so he had his immediate needs covered. And I was talking to him just one-on-one, unprompted, unscripted. I said, tell me what you need. What would be helpful to you? You know, if you could tell policymakers or people in charge of these kind of programs, what do you think would be helpful to you or other people that have had your same experience to address some of these challenging things you've had to deal with? And I was very surprised at his response. He said, I just want a hand up, not a hand out. And I hadn't coached him or anything on this yet. As we talked further, he was articulating that he wanted to work. He came to Utah initially because he heard our economy was good. And it was. And then the Great Recession happened, and that, of course, kind of ruined things on the economic front and led to the situation he was in. But he had this hunger, this desire to work, to earn his way up and out. He was already having his immediate needs met through the supportive housing program that he was in, through probably a number of other programs. But that's not thriving. That's not flourishing. That's, again, subsisting. It's stabilizing, which can be very important if it's connected to this next step of how do we help you move towards flourishing and thriving. And I don't see a way that can happen without a sustained connection to work.
Corey, I'm sorry. One last follow-up, and then I'll turn it over to you. I love that you brought in the anecdote, that story. I love your instinct to communicate in the story, and that resonates with me absolutely. I'm also wondering now further, is there any data that you have when you're going through, you're compiling all of the anecdotes into reports that speaks to how do people that are in need of some sort of welfare, that are in poverty, feel towards the word socialism and the ideas that socialism represents?
It's an excellent question. I don't have a great immediate answer to that, at least as far as the work that we've done. We have not pulled directly on sentiment toward terms like that. I think when in the polling that we have done and in the conversations that we have done, and again, I'll rely on our friends at the Georgia Center for Opportunity, a number of whom have done great work on the importance of work, the dignity of work, that there are various non-economic benefits to work, that it's not just from an economic standpoint that, well, if you work, you earn a paycheck, you have more income. That's an important part of it. But there are other factors that, again, I'll point folks to GCO that I think has some additional expertise on that specific point beyond what I have. But again, all of our conversations and our survey data is oriented towards this question of work specifically and what is standing in the way of your work. And some of the findings that we had that in Utah, in the safety net population, according to our survey data, 43% of our respondents said that at some point they had intentionally constrained their earned income or their economic progression because they were worried about triggering a benefit cliff. And the most common behavior was just to stop looking, stop pursuing new jobs, stop looking for opportunities or promotions or raises or those kinds of things. So it's a little bit of you could call it just a plateau effect or a treadmill effect or whatever analogy you want to bring to the table. But just that feeling of, why should I keep trying? Because even if I earn more, I'm not going to be any better off, and I might even be worse off. And so that 43% number has really stuck with me. And you pair those data points where, again, in each of those actions, folks have at times have reduced the number of hours they could have worked because of the benefit cliff factor. They have turned down actual jobs or raises or promotions. In some instances, they've decided to not get married. That was about 1 in 10 of our respondents, and that tracks with some of the other data elsewhere in the country. And so a number of key sort of steps of progression in life, work and opportunity, and institutions like marriage, where the way that I would extrapolate it is they would have said yes to those opportunities were it not for this barrier, this disincentive of a benefit cliff. And so I think the evidence, again, is largely in these families of their desire and their push for work opportunities. That, again, we have to elevate this conversation as a nation in the right way, especially in the midst of all the debates going on in Washington around work and safety net reform and all these different things.
Yeah, and I love that you guys have really done a great job of leaning into listening to the people that are most impacted by this, right? Like you're not just, I think one of the problems we can run into is we can just be like, well, we know what the solution is. We'll just figure it out. We'll get it passed. We'll get it through. But you're actually listening to the people that are directly impacted by this. And that was something that I remember when I worked for because I came from Georgia Center for Opportunity. Nick, you and I worked a lot on different things, but I remember we did a survey of people in poverty, and I got to sit there and just watch hours and hours of video of them being interviewed and listening to their experience. And not once did they say, man, if the government just gave me more money, I would be totally fixed. They were like, I want opportunity. I want out of this situation. Like, this is not the end. This is the beginning of my story. Right. And so that idea of like listening to people and stabilization is important, right? Like so a lot of times people just need something there to stabilize their experience, and then they can maybe get their head above water to look out and see where they want to go. What's your guys's like? How have you kind of taken on that story gathering piece of like letting the experience of people inform your policy versus just you telling them what to think, so to speak?
Yeah, and it's an easy temptation for those of us who work in the public policy world. And I say this with a ton of love and respect for the policy think tank world. Sutherland Institute, we are a think tank. These other organizations we talk with a lot and work with a lot are think tanks. Some of my favorite organizations on earth are think tanks. And so this is no way to diminish the important work that policy think tanks do or policy professionals at various levels do. But I do think that there is a risk at times or a temptation at times to look purely at the data and then think that that tells you everything you need to know about how to deploy or what to deploy in terms of policy interventions to solve problems. And again, the data piece is vital. It's absolutely essential. And many of us in the public policy world use data and bring data to the table, and rightfully so. But the reason sort of shifting the lens to the families themselves is so important, especially with this issue, with safety net reform, with benefits cliffs, with upward mobility. If you are purely approaching from a data perspective on the benefits cliffs issue, you would look at the modeling data, you would look at some of the economic analyses about, they call it marginal tax rates or things like that. And you would reach certain conclusions about what the nature of the problem was. And you might say, well, look, we've modeled. Here is a benefit cliff. We need to go fix that. But one of the things that we found, and again, this what I would call healthy pushback in the years that we've been trying to have this conversation here in Utah is, okay, but what are people actually doing? Because if it's modeled in a certain way, but that doesn't actually correlate with people changing their behavior, is it really an issue? And in other instances, you do have some good, what I would call good faith disagreement at times of the nature and scope of the benefit cliff problem. Because sometimes there's an argument that, well, maybe there's just an information gap, that these programs are complex. And so how often do these families actually really understand what's going on? Is a benefit cliff, how big does the drop have to be for it to count as a cliff? If you go only through the lens of data, you get into a lot of those kind of nuanced, data-driven debates, which, again, I'm not saying are bad, but you could get mired in that for a while. You're in problem definition mode for too long before you have a chance to get into solution mode. And all the while, if we're writing white papers and debating with folks in the policy world about the economic data and the true nature and scope of the benefit cliff problem, and if we're stuck there, again, we have families that we've sat and talked with who are just waiting. They're still feeling stuck. They're hoping for better opportunities to come their way. And so the reason that it's so important to focus on the story aspect is if you reframe the issue, and instead of just saying, hey, there's a programmatic problem in these safety nets called benefits cliff, so we need to fix it. I'm not saying that's incorrect. I think that's true. But if you reframe it as way too many families all across America and in Utah, the upward mobility capital of the nation, are turning down economic opportunities because they're worried it would make them worse off just because of the way they experience the social safety net. That is wrong. That's not only economically problematic, it's immoral that in our society, we pride ourselves, not just in Utah, but in America, as an upwardly mobile society. And the fact that any family might perceive or actually experience the feeling of, well, me working harder, earning more, makes my family worse off, or at least keeps us stuck, is a fundamental moral wrong. And so shifting it back to that, it brings everyone into the tent, regardless of what their political persuasion is, what their background is, kind of where they sit in terms of their professional work as it relates to this issue. Everyone can agree with, well, yeah, we don't want any family to say no to a great economic opportunity because they think it would make them worse off. We agree with that. Let's fix it. It opens the door to a consensus discussion in a way that few other things can.
Well, Nic, that's beautifully said. And I love always your focus on stories and all these family stories. So I'd like to hear more about you. What's your story? What's your background? How did you grow up and how did that shape you?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, James, you mentioned some of your personal experiences that have helped shape how you come to this issue. And in a lot of our conversations with other folks who work in this space, there's a lot of similar experiences of, folks who have experienced poverty and that's motivated them to come to the table. That wasn't my experience. I have never really experienced poverty in my personal life. I've been very blessed and very fortunate. Of course, very, very grateful for that. But had, I don't know, I guess a normal upbringing in my family. Grew up in southern Nevada. So Nevadan by birth, but a Utahn by choice now. I've lived in Utah for quite a while, and I love it here. But in my experiences, kind of this, whether you call it the conservative movement or the opportunity movement, whatever kind of labels you would apply, there were a few instances where some experiences that I had really helped to shape my orientation towards these kinds of issues. And the first was probably when I came out of college. I initially studied broadcast journalism and political science. I wanted to go into broadcasting, and I worked in radio, living in Reno, Nevada at the time, the University of Nevada, Reno, and loved it and intended to go that direction. But when I was finishing my undergrad, I felt like I wasn't smart enough. I didn't know enough things to be the kind of professional that I wanted to be, to try and make a difference. And I had a great professor who gave me some really good advice to consider graduate school. And through those conversations, ended up moving out here to Utah to do a master's in public policy at the University of Utah. That kind of helped set me on this public policy track. But it was when I was in Utah and I got a job working as the speechwriter for Utah's governor at the time, who was Governor Gary Herbert. And sort of working in that capacity in the thick of state-level governance, where, when you're a speechwriter, you have a lot of direct one-on-one interaction with your principal, in this case, the governor. And speechwriting, you have to kind of get into their mind and write what they would write, what they would say, and it's a partnership. It's a collaborative process to where it's their words, it's their messages. You are just helping to guide it, to put it on paper. And through that experience, kind of seeing this behind-the-scenes look at the way our governor strove to govern in the state of Utah, and then seeing all of the things that Utah was doing really well from a management standpoint, from a conservative principle standpoint, it was probably the first time that I really saw the evidence of, these ideas, these principles actually work really well, because it works really well here in Utah. Utah is a great example of what I would call principled, pragmatic, conservative governance, and really adhering to, in many ways, the core principles of the American founding and our civic institutions that have led this country to flourish. So that was one where I saw it in practice. I saw that this stuff actually works, and that was really compelling to me to see it firsthand like that. The other one was what I alluded to before, but just that experience talking to the formerly homeless man who articulated that desire for a hand up and not a hand out. And that, it was an anchor moment for me. And ever since then, whenever I have worked on this issue or even thought about this issue, often I think back to him, because he was really hungry for this opportunity to work, to earn his way up and out of poverty. And that changed things for me, because it really showed me that, again, as someone who hasn't experienced this stuff directly, I've had a very blessed, fortunate life, and I'm very grateful for that. But for folks who do experience this, the importance of orienting these programs towards the truth that you are an asset to society, to your family, to your community. We need you. We need you to fulfill your potential, rather than saying, well, again, borrow Arthur Brooks' terminology, that these kinds of families are not liabilities to manage. They are assets to develop, because they have tremendous potential that they can offer. And that was really kind of a moving thing for me. And when the book The Conservative Heart came out, I think it was 2015 or so, from Arthur Brooks, that kind of felt like the Bible, if you will. I kind of felt like, well, this is what I've been looking for, because, again, considering myself a political conservative and thinking, well, what's our answer to poverty, to opportunity and upward mobility? And I read that and I said, this is it. Like, before, I didn't know the how of what we implement and how we do it, but that was a really impactful guide. And all this boils down to, I think, this is an oversimplification, but I think in many ways, the promise of America can be simplified to two things: freedom and opportunity. The constitutional structure is oriented to secure and protect our freedoms, our inalienable rights. It's also oriented to protect opportunity, and our civic institutions do that as well, and our free enterprise system does that as well. And so, to me, for anyone who's engaged in the opportunity movement, you are building up a core pillar of America, of what it means to live in this wonderful country. And especially for any of us who have not experienced some of the difficulties that our fellow Americans have experienced, I think we have a moral compulsion, a responsibility to help. I certainly feel that in my own life. My religious faith informs me and motivates me and compels me to try and make a difference for these fellow Utahns and fellow Americans. And if I don't do that, I'm wasting, to some respect, the wonderful blessings that I've been given in this life. And I think that it's a rallying cry for all Americans. I think we'd all agree that freedom and opportunity are essential. And that's a lot of what we should orient our public policy interventions towards.
Hear, hear.
That's awesome. And I love what you said earlier about like not resting on your laurels. And I know, again, Sutherland has taken on this fight in your own state. In Utah, yes, they're leading, but there are still more people out there that are living in poverty, that they're not seeing that upward mobility. They're not actually having an opportunity to break out of their situation. So I love that you guys have not just championed it, but championed their voices, but you've also kind of led the nation, both as a state and as an organization, on this matter.
Well, and I think in addition to that, again, going back to this principle of federalism, that we talk often about federalism in terms of, well, the federal government likes to overreach and we should let the states figure things out. And that's true from a principle standpoint. Again, if you go back to constitutional scholars that are far wiser than I will provide more eloquent articulation of that principle, but I think it's fundamentally true. But also there's a very practical side to it, that if for any listeners out there that consider themselves now or potential future champions of the opportunity movement, if you look at how to change things in Congress, it's obviously extremely difficult and slow. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Of course we need to keep moving things forward on the federal level, especially because these safety net programs are largely federal programs. But it also means that we need to recognize the power that states have. In my view, one of the greatest legislative accomplishments this country has had in my lifetime is the 1990s welfare reform legislation. It was a great achievement because, one, it just fundamentally improved things for low-income families, largely single moms with kids, that were recipients of these programs. You look at all the evidence of the increasing work rates, the decreasing poverty rates in the decades since, I think it was 1996 when that legislation was passed. So it had a huge impact on, again, strengthening actual opportunity and upward mobility for families who are hungry for it, who otherwise were feeling a little stuck. Secondly, it happened in divided government. You had a Democratic president, a Republican Congress, and they came together to achieve this consensus legislation that changed countless lives. But they did that under divided government, and it's been a durable policy intervention ever since. And so I think the lessons for that are the importance of being able to, I'll borrow from Yuval Levin, AEI scholar and author of a new book on the American Constitution, this idea of broadening your coalition, making broader, more durable coalitions. That's how you get policy done that lasts and you don't have the ping pong effect back and forth that sometimes we see now in the current and previous administration. But also that reform was started largely at the state level. It was states, think tanks, governors, state legislators saying, let's try out some different things and let's see what works. And then that can build momentum for reforms on the federal level. So I think when I look at how the opportunity that the state of Utah has and that Sutherland Institute has to make a difference on this issue, I really believe that we are in the beginning stages of a welfare reform 2.0 kind of movement. That there was a lot of good done in the 90s. There's still some additional work to be done. There have been tremendous things done at the state level, especially here in Utah, with the really remarkable way that our Department of Workforce Services has found a way to administer these programs in a way that's better for these customers than you'll find elsewhere in the nation. And they've really done tremendous work, made significant progress. I think building on that, to say that we at the state level, and I think Utah's well positioned to lead on that, to identify innovative pilots and test things and reforms that we can try out and see what works at the state level. That's how it's supposed to work. And then the good ideas will percolate to other states and percolate up to Congress. And that's how we can usher in, again, a new movement of reform for the millions of Americans that are hungry for that opportunity that currently feel stuck. That's why I'm so passionate about it, that it can and should start at the state level, obviously working with federal partners as well. But there's incredible power in the nimbleness and the close representation that state policymakers have to be innovative and try things that can get traction. And it really feels like we're in that right now. We're just in the early stages. And I'm hopeful. My greatest hope is that the things we're doing here in Utah, the things that the folks are doing in Georgia, the one-door movement that's been discussed in Congress, all of these things coming together, and many, many great leaders in many different states working on this. But all of these things coming together to, again, usher in a new movement of reform so that we can look back in 2, 5, 10 years, however long it takes, say, wow, we did something really meaningful, and look at all of the American families that are better off because of it, because they are now better empowered to enjoy the blessings of work-based self-reliance. That's what we're aiming for.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for casting that future that you have there for your goals that you have at Sutherland and then in Utah and beyond. I think that vision is incredibly exciting, and the way you described it was beautiful. So thank you, Nic. It was a pleasure getting to chat with you.
Thank you. A pleasure for me as well, and thanks for everything you guys do, and the resources and the help that SPN provides. It's really encouraging and amazing to be part of a nationwide network of folks who want to, again, strengthen and increase freedom and opportunity. So it's a joy to play a part of it. So I'm very grateful.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you're a part, Nic. And Corey, thank you again for co-hosting with me today.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us here on Neighbors in the Network. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Neighbors in the Network, a podcast by the State Policy Network that explores state-based solutions, federalism, and public policy through insightful conversations with incredible individuals working to empower local governance and liberty for all.